Hello, everyone. So today I'm here with Ashley once again. Welcome back, Ashley. And today we're going to talk about how to properly use the ego, the different components that compose the ego, and how to use them effectively in your life without inflating the ego. This is a very big problem. Inflating the ego is not using the ego correctly, and is really drawing away from your human experience. So, Ashley, when it comes to the ego, is there any basic points that you would like to start out with into how not to inflate it, but to actually use it in your life properly, how we're supposed to as skillful human beings?
Yeah, so the ego is definitely it's kind of like a double-edged sword. It's a very negative thing sometimes, and it can be used for a lot of positive things. Like we wouldn't be making this video right now if our egos weren't like, "Hey, let's do something," you know?
Yeah.
So the ego does give us drive to accomplish different tasks, and so there's some positive aspects to the ego.
It helps us differentiate between, I mean, at first, it's good to be able to differentiate between yourself and other things because that's how we eventually grow to a super consciousness. Is that once we get, it's a necessary step between the animal instinct, then we have the regular human ego, then we have an enlightened human being, and there's a lot of phases in between, but it's a very necessary building block for us becoming completely skillful human beings, I guess you could say. Now we were going to go into guardian angels and attending demons, and these are just very rough terms. They're not meant to represent demons in the sense that most people think of them as, or angels in the sense that most people think of them as. It's just a really rough term to help you understand different parts of the ego, different parts of yourself, the different influences within your own brain. So, when it comes to guardian angels, do you feel like there's an influence within that either helps you to refine the ego or help you to abolish it? Or is there an attending demon? I call it attending demon. You might call it the shadow self that also influences from a different perspective and tries to pull you towards the ego. Or is that how it works? Go ahead and take it away.
I think both the angelic aspects of our consciousness that would be within our egoic mind, like it's a filter that we use to understand the world around us. I think both the angelic and the demonic side are kind of interrelated. I don't necessarily think one is inherently better than the other. People can get very, how do I say, like when people get full of themselves because they're like, oh, I'm so spiritual or I'm so Christian or I'm so this, and they get like kind of like
That that
fully.
inflates that inflates the ego, and
Yeah, and
and
that's
they
an
try, but
side.
people aren't always aware of it, and that's the difficult part of it. People aren't usually aware of that.
Exactly. So like I think that would be like the negative aspect of the angelic realm of the consciousness, like from the egoic consciousness when we're tapping into angelic, like the more positive angels.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think, if you choose to believe in angels or demons, is kind of more the question. And they're just thought forms in my belief system. They're just thought forms that we can give power to, and thought forms can be useful for different things. So.
Yeah, I think that it's a combination of both. I think that the original understanding of angels and demons are these very individual beings within ourselves. Now they also exist separately in many cases, but every single human being that is sentient has two polar opposite influences that pull them in this or that way. And that's why I usually identify the angel as the conscience, whereas the demon is more like the id that pulls you towards ego manifestation, but pulls you more towards satisfaction rather than development of you as an individual. But that's just a very basic kind of a Freudian understanding of it. But I think that really wraps up my idea as far as the guardian angel and the id, the demon. And now, like I said, recently in my life, in the last 2 weeks, I'd always, I've known my personal, my guardian angel for a long time since I was in high school. He really manifested, and I realized he was within. He's part of my conscience. He always knows what's right. And only recently did I start to realize that I also have an attending demon. Now, I was basically implored by my own psyche to constantly envision this woman, and I never really knew her name, and we always had these exchanges within myself. these conversations in a way, but it wasn't necessarily words. It was always more like something that's higher, a higher level of understanding, a higher level of exchange. And not not until recently that I realized that I'm not looking for this woman externally. I'm not going to find her externally. This woman is a part of myself. And after I realized that, I started to see, okay, I have these two sides of myself. And I started to really place my ego in a new way, just about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I feel like a more self-contained human being because I'm not seeking something that's external. I started to realize that all these exchanges between myself, my guardian angel, and my attending demon are all these exchanges are happening within, and really understanding what's happening within myself is the next step for me. I feel far less reliant on other people because I don't feel the need to bring an external reality into focus because I realize that internal reality is the one that I've been trying to bring into focus. So when it comes to these influences within yourself, do you feel like there's a part of yourself that constantly drags you towards chaos, and that there's a part that constantly drags you towards order? Or do you think that it can be understood in that duality? Or do you think that duality is, ultimately duality doesn't exist, but do you think that duality is useful within yourself as far as classifying these different parts?
I think that duality is useful, and classification can be helpful for me to navigate the like cognitive waters, I guess, for lack of a
Yeah.
better term. Um, so, for example, I think that things that would be considered positive, like order, can also be very negative. For example, like some forms of militant order, like I think it would be Kantian ethics. Those would be like the ends justify the means. Like that's not positive. And I think within
Are you
myself, like
talking
it
about
can
something
be.
like Nietzsche? Because I don't recognize the term Kantian. Oh, you mean
And
Kant? You mean the
yeah,
philosopher Kant? Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been in Western philosophy. I did take a class, but no, I see what you're saying.
All right. Um, yeah, but I lost my train of thought, so okay.
So, uh, a lot of things that Freud said were incorrect. It can't be divided between the it and the superego all the time, and we are in between these two forces. But I think that within every single individual, there is like every single individual is like a nation or a city of influences constantly vying for either attention or manifestation in the external world. Um, have you in your life classified these different influences within yourself, or do you just see yourself as one whole singular influence?
Well, I think of myself as one sentient being, but I also see like the entire universe as one sentient being. So I do tend to classify everything, but that's just because I like things like lists, and I like to study lists and like the
Yeah.
periodic table of elements. Like I think that it's helpful to be able to understand if I'm coming from like my ego. I call it my higher self, usually like the angelic realm. I don't think that's as much part of the ego. I think it's like a bridge between, it's like a gatekeeper between the ego and higher consciousness. So depending on the
Okay.
type of angel or even the type of demon, like if there's a sacred lesson that a demon needs to teach me, I'm all about it, like because overcoming fear is a very positive thing and it's empowering. So
Yeah. So, do you believe that there are higher realms where angels exist and lower realms where demons exist? Do you think that there is a multiverse in that sense, or do you think that that's all us trying to understand a vaster cosmos that we have trouble seeing without duality?
well, I think for sure we know that we're trying to figure it all out. So for sure it's a concept and it's an idea that humans have created. Do I personally believe in a multiverse? Yeah, because I believe in quantum mechanics and like Einsteinian mechanics. Like I don't believe in Newtonian physics as much as Einsteinian or quantum mechanics. So yeah, I do believe in the multiverse, and I believe that within myself, it's the same overall structure as that which is without, as within, so without, as above, so below. So
So infinite in all directions, infinitely microcosmic and infinitely macrocosmic, and
exactly.
there's a similar strain between everything. You might want to center your camera a little bit because you're floating off. There you go. No, there we go. Yeah, you're
It
floating
looks
off
like
to one side.
it looks
But
like so it's very misleading because like it looks like I'm on there. But okay.
yeah, no,
Thank
I
you.
understand. I've just been dealing with Skype for a long time, so I kind of know. But yeah, I Infinite in All Directions is actually a book that I was reading for a long time, and I didn't finish it, but I studied it, and it was this idea of spirituality and mathematics being very similar, and there are equivalencies in everything, and of course, like the what do you call it, the Frenchio code or something like that. I can't remember, where it's like that repeating pattern in nature that we see in all things.
The
Um,
Fibonacci
yeah,
sequence.
yeah, that's it.
And that's
But
based on phi. So phi is the perfect, and Fibonacci is like the. So in nature, it's Fibonacci, and then phi is like the perfect thing. So, yeah. Or
um,
maybe it's pi. I don't. I read a lot, but I don't talk a lot. So.
yeah. I mean, it's hard to once you hear it pronounced, it might sound different. But yeah, I understand. Do you think that what traditions do you think understand the ego best? I guess you could say, because I mean, I feel like a lot of the Abrahamic traditions, the ego it's very dual, and they're really, and even Christianity, it seems like the ego doesn't really. There's not a lot of information on the ego, but in Buddhism, which is the first religion I started studying, the ego is it's just a huge part of the different traditions in Buddhism, no matter what form of Buddhism that you practice. And in Buddhism, there's this kind of unified idea that that the ego is necessary and it has to be there, but at the same time, you have to use it correctly. You have to use it skillfully. In Hinduism, I mean, well, there's so many different Hindu ideas. It's hard to say that every Hindu believes one thing, but since I'm Hindu, I usually think of the ego as something we have to overcome, and to see the grander pattern and how we fit in and how we're one with everything else. I'm very Vedantic in that sense. If you had to classify yourself as one tradition that you think kind of tells what your beliefs about the ego is, what would which tradition are you gravitating towards as far as the teachings about the ego?
About the ego specifically, it would definitely be Hinduism and Buddhism, like the Eastern philosophies. But Buddhism came out of Hinduism, so that makes sense. But I think Buddhism really like explores the ego. It's like basically the whole religion is focused on overcoming the ego. But yeah, I'd say Hinduism and Buddhism for sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think within the sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think within the Abrahamic faiths, if you use a filter of understanding, like from a more Gnostic space, then you can read the whole Bible and understand that it's just one battle of like the ego versus shadow elements, like the angels and demons, like different parts of consciousness. I mean, like the Old Testament Yahweh or Hashem, is very ego identified. He's a very like angry, militant type of a god. And then, in the New Testament, he's more of like a redeemer and all that. So, I mean, I think basically any holy scripture you can like get a lot of worth out of if you look at it from a Gnostic space.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Swami Sri Yukteswar that said the Bible is a very metaphysical book, and when you start to see people taking it completely literally and demanding other people to follow it, different rules that their laws are trying to enact in society based on their beliefs and forcing it onto other people, we start to see how when you take something completely literally and you take laws that were given to a certain people at a certain time many, many centuries ago, you start to get a tyranny of religion. And just like we see in the Old Testament, New Testament, the lesson changes over time based on what human beings can understand at different places at different times. And so we as human beings are, at least as far as I'm concerned, spiritually evolving. So I think that to assume that a book that was written thousands of years ago is supposed to be valid for the rest of time and human development, I think that it's foolish, because we as human beings are growing and evolving, and just like we saw in the evolution of the New Testament from the Old, there are different lessons to be had. Not everything is known yet, and not everything not every rule is laid down absolutely. We don't there is no absolute rule for the rest of time. What we can understand in our relationship to God advances over time. So what advice would you give to somebody who's trying to overcome their pride or egoic tendencies? Like, what are a few ideas as far as you would recommend?
I would ask that a person first examine whether they're coming from a loving heart space and seeking the good of all of the people involved in their life or whatever situation that they're encountering. That's a good way to at least use the ego for good, and it starts aligning your essence to higher vibrational frequencies.
That's definitely good advice. My relationship with the ego has been, it just constantly evolves, and the more I start to understand gods and get closer to them, the more that I start to realize that they, at least the gods that I work with, Odin and especially the Divine Mother Kali Ma, they exist as a function for the grander whole, for the multiverse. They are beings who are using their ego so effectively and so skillfully that they've gained a station, to basically be an example for the rest of us as we approach our own godhood. And of course, there are abyssal cults and different cults that follow the different princes of the nine hells, what have you. And there's different names for these things in different traditions. But I think that the more you try to solidify your ego and become a god through a solidification of ego, and not as a function for helping other parts of the multiverse and other beings in the multiverse get to where you're at, I think that through that isolation, when you just enhance the ego and try to solidify it, you can become a great being, but that will be a being that experiences great pain, great isolation. Because the more you isolate the ego, the more you cut it off, the more you inflate it, you can reach very much power, but it it takes away from the connection to the grander whole that we need as souls, that we've always been working towards, and we've always been trying to learn these lessons. We've always been encouraged to learn these lessons. It just takes some beings a very long time to do so. I'm somebody who believes that there's redemption even for a being like Satan. But I understand Satan differently than Christians, of course. But
I think of Satan as basically the embodiment of the negative aspects of the ego.
that's
Like
fair.
that for
That's
the
fair.
he's like the collective, the multiverse aspect of
Mhm.
like he'd be like the personification, the energetic form of God's ego.
And think of how lonely that would be, because the constantly focused on power, that isolates you from really being that power for everyone. Um, and I think that every single god or being like Satan, I think it's more of a station than an actual singular being. I think that every god holds a station, but there's been many souls that have gone through that station, kind of like a job, because every station is required to serve the grander multiverse. Even Satan holds the counterbalance to God, to allow material existence to be here, to allow creation to exist. Otherwise, everything would be pulled up just instantly. So,
Yeah.
so I mean, that's one of the reasons I think that a being like Satan is required. But like Kriyananda said, as he learned from Paramahansa Yogananda, he said that the villain is necessary. But if you're going to play the villain, be willing to accept the villain's punishment for your actions, basically. Um, but yes, everything is necessary. So, in closing this video, is there any closing thoughts that you want to put out there about the ego, or do you want me to just put some of mine out there?
Um, any closing thoughts about the ego? I would say just look at it kind of like a pet and use it for good. Like it's just a part of your essence, but it's not like your total essence. So use it for good things. And when we look at everyone around us as just an extension of our consciousness, then it's harder to treat people ill. So,
Yeah, I can definitely second that. I think that a couple of my closing thoughts is it's a long process of figuring out how to use the person that you are to the best gain for yourself and everybody else around you. it's a long process, and it isn't something that's either black or white or good or evil. The ego makes life very complicated, but it's also necessary. So we have to focus on figuring out how to use it skillfully and using it skillfully. So I thank you very much, Ashley, for joining me on my channel. Go ahead and tell me what your channel is, so that people know, and I can put it down in the comment section.
It's Amethyst TV, and I have a band website and a band Facebook and YouTube, but we'll do that a different time. So
I mean, you can include it if you want. I mean,
okay, it's Amatista. That's the Amatista official. So that's my band.
okay, is that on Facebook, or is that the website?
That's on YouTube, and I do have a Facebook for it, but there's really not much on it yet. So
okay.
I just started releasing music. So
okay, well, we all hope to hear more from you from the future, both from your band and your videos that you're putting on YouTube now. So thank you very much for joining me, Ashley, and thank you very much for watching at home, and I hope to see all of you on my channel in the future.